This episode of the Befores and Afters podcast is sponsored by Side Effects. Looking for great customer case studies, presentations, and demos? Head to the Side Effects YouTube channel. There you'll find tons of Houdini, Solaris, and Karma content. This includes recordings of recent Houdini Hive sessions from around the world. Go to youtube.com/Houdini3D. Hi everyone, welcome to the Befores and Afters podcast. I'm Ian Fales from Befores and Afters. Today we're discussing The Mandalorian Season 3 with production VFX supervisor Grady Cofer and production animation supervisor Hal Hickel. Both hail from ILM, but oversaw the efforts of all the vendors on this past season. There's literally 4,000 to 5,000 shots in a season. That's a lot of work. So we jump into what was new for Season 3, including where ILM's StageCraft was used this time, and where practical effects came into play as well, including puppeteering and CG work involving Grogu and IG-12. We also talk about a few key moments in Season 3, especially the final battle sequence with the jetpack action in Mandalore. Let's jump into the chat with Grady and Hal now. Hi Grady, hi Hal, how are you guys?
Very good, Ian. Good, thanks for having us.
Nice to be on your time zone. I've just had a week at SIGGRAPH and enjoying LA. Really excited to talk about Mandalorian Season 3. Grady, I thought I'd start by asking you, ILM and Lucasfilm work on so many of these big shows now and, use very amazing tech from StageCraft, and there's always a great mix of practical effects and, of course, great digital effects from ILM and different vendors. But I'm curious on Mandalorian Season 3, what you felt were some of the new challenges and new approaches you had to make specifically for this third season.
Sure, yeah. Well, thanks, Ian, for that question. I think, first of all, this was my first season on the show. Richard Bluff handled the first two and did a brilliant job working with Hal here. So I come to the show as a bit of a fan, to be honest. Like, me and my family just loved the show. I feel kind of lucky to have inherited this role on a show that just does so many things right, in my opinion. And one of those is exactly what you mentioned. It's that balance. It's that alchemy of kind of aiming for the highest level of computer graphics and animation, but then tempering that, kind of balancing that with all of the old school tricks, right? The old traditional techniques like animatronics and model miniatures and practical creature effects, all of those things, which I get really excited about, and because it helps make the work feel a little bit more like lived in and a little bit more handcrafted. So that, to me, is the alchemy that makes The Mandalorian so special. It's what makes it what it is. And we, of course, were very intentional about maintaining that balance this year. But the challenge was probably that I think most people would agree this season was huge, right? It was really epic. And we could see over the course of the seasons, it's grown, right? Like, it started very small, very personal with Mando and Grogu and the characters that they meet and the adventures that they kind of have. And then they started, the character arc they started introducing kind of larger stories and introducing kind of other characters. And it was all building to this season, right? The themes that John has been kind of exploring throughout all seasons, but has really got into this season, like redemption. We have Dim's redemption, obviously, for removing his helmet. We have Bo's redemption because she feels kind of responsible for the plight of Mandalore, and what does that mean? How can she be welcomed back into the fold of her family? We have the reunification of all the disparate factions of Mandalore to retake their home world. These are huge, right? These are big, big stories, and they read big on the page, as Hal and Paul and myself were going through the scripts and working with John. It's like, oh, okay, we've got a big creature here. We've got a big set piece here. We have like this awesome dogfight, and then this massive kind of epic battle at the end. So the challenge, I think, this season was to do all of that, not just the bulk of the work, but like to kind of raise the level of visuals and animation in order to support these epic stories but staying true to kind of what makes The Mandalorian so special.
Yes, and you're right. It is such a big show. How, from your point of view, from animation point of view, what were the biggest challenges, or what were the new things you felt you needed to approach?
Yeah, the biggest challenge this series has offered season after season, honestly, is the amount of work. We're talking somewhere in the neighborhood of between 4,000 and 5,000 shots for a season, and that's like double a big summer tentpole film. And we're doing it in roughly the same amount of time at the same level of quality. So that's always the biggest challenge, I'd say. In terms of specific creative challenges of this season, we had lots of aerial work, like lots more than usual. We had both space kind of dogfights. We had dogfights in atmosphere down close to the ground, Bo and Mando taking on TIE fighters. We had this winged creature stealing the kid off the beach, and the rescue of that kid, and that whole jetpack rescue, and then tons of jetpack action in the 7th and 8th episodes with, the Mandos fighting the troopers, these, Moff Gideon super troopers down in the caves of Mandalore. And it was just way more of that than we've had before. And that stuff's tough to do because you want to get the flight dynamics right, and that's always tricky, but it's something that people kind of have a weird intuitive lizard brain understanding of, so it kind of needs to be right and to feel right, otherwise it just feels like a cartoon. So it's tough to do. And then there's lots of considerations about how you shoot it, where you put the camera, and John is very, very, very interested in that. We have lots of conversations when we're first presenting animation or concepts, even previs, whatever, the very first ideas about an action sequence. He's always keen to understand, if this were a real thing, how would we have shot it? Because it's important to him to ground that camera language in a way that the audience feels like, oh, that's a helmet mounted camera. I understand that from all the GoPro stuff I've seen on the YouTube. That's an outrigger camera on one of the ships. I understand that film language. That's air to air, but I'm not so close that it feels magical. It feels like it was shot from a chasing airplane, that kind of thing. So I'd say those sequences. The other thing that was really fun and challenging was this mech spider creature thing that captures man down in the depths of Mandalore. That was cool. It had a different flavor from other mech stuff we've done in Star Wars up to now. Usually the droids tend to be fairly polished, with the exception maybe of IG-11, who's kind of janky, but most of the stuff, like the Scorpion X and Book of Boba Fett, etc., tend to be pretty polished looking, or like if you go all the way back to the Droidekas and Phantom Menace, etc. Whereas this thing was rusty mech, crazy scrapped together thing, hiding in the dirt that springs up and traps him, and so that was great. And some of the inspiration for that, certainly for the whole environment and vibe of the sequences, came from Phil Tippett, his involvement with the season this year as kind of a conceptor of weirdness. and I should mention Paul Cavanaugh and I split Anim Soup duties on this season to help deal with the massive volume, and that sequence was all Paul, and he contributed some great ideas, like the head popping off and crawling away. So really great work. I really enjoyed watching that sequence form kind of from the outside while I was off working on other stuff.
Grady, as you've come onto the series for the first time, I do want to ask you about the use of StageCraft on season 3. What actually was that like personally for you? Obviously, you would have seen it in use in ILM for several years now. And again, I guess, where did the showrunners, where did you feel like it could be used best in this series?
I was really excited to experience StageCraft and with all the development that this show has it's come a long way over these last few seasons, and kind of watching that happen. But I remember in early days, on ILM stage, them working with cave, they had the cave technology and working in VR and stuff. And so there were a lot of earlier incarnations of this. And I love virtual production. I enjoy that tool set and the way you can bring a lot of kind of creative design early on during a show and start committing to the development of environments and creatures and all of this in VR, and then bring that into previs, and then the ability to then play back that live in real time on walls in StageCraft, either in ILM's Helios or Unreal, is fantastic, right? To me, I'm a compositor, so many of the shots would just be blue screens. If it's a set that you can't build in entirety, you have to make those decisions. You say, okay, I'm going to build this much of a set. The rest is going to be blue screen. You're there kind of on the day, and your DP is looking at a lot of blue, and that really kind of affects your framing. It affects your shot design. It affects performances, because all of a sudden you're acting with a chair and a half a wall or something, but nothing else. So I'm a big advocate of it. It's not the solution for everything, though, Ian. And that's, I think, over the course of the first 2 seasons, I think we've discovered where it really thrives. I mean, it's really, really clever to use. And so this season, we aimed to be like very intentional about what shots, what scenes we wanted to accomplish in virtual production on the LED stage. I'll throw out one, and this is just, it's not a big one. I mean, I don't even know, but like the scene is not very long, but there's in Bryce's episode, in episode 6, you have Bo and Mando, and they're on this, it's kind of a caper, right? They're trying to solve this mystery, and they go down an elevator to visit the Ugnaught workshop down below. So this is just one of many kind of one-off environments this season, and it all started in Doug Chang's group, and so they make these beautiful kind of concepts for it, and we give feedback, and he reviews that with John, and everyone starts liking these images. Well, the great thing about Doug's group is a lot of his concept artists that at ILM we worked with for many, many years, they work in 3D anyway, right? They're sculpting their own sets, they're building things in 3D, and then of course they're doing paint and projection and all those kind of, they're just great artists, but they're using whatever tool they can. So you're not starting over in the VAD. You generally already are starting with a model for that environment that you've been seeing in concepts. So now that goes to the VAD, the virtual art department, and then under, Andrew Jones, who's phenomenal and has a great history in virtual production with John on his movies, Jungle Book, and now you have those sets, and you start thinking about, okay, what parts could I build? What parts could be virtual? Is this good for a stage? Should it be like a set? Should it be outside? Or maybe this could also be a virtual production. We could do this on using StageCraft. So he and I would have many meetings where we pop into VR, right? So we put on our headsets, and we all meet inside of that set, and we scout it, we walk around, and then the haggling begins, where it's like, okay, if you built this, we could extend here, and maybe we could bring in the curved wall, because we actually had an additional wall that we built this season to maybe hide this scene, and then maybe that, you try that out and it doesn't work, but you're doing that all virtually, right? This is just all in headset. So eventually you settle on, okay, this is a nice layout, and we all kind of decide on what part I might own digitally, and he's going to actually build physically. Then that goes to ILM's content team. They do the work. Well, anyway, so you cut to the day of the shoot, and you walk into that set, and it just looks like a beautiful, you're at a huge factory, and you see, you see these droids kind of hanging, from the rafters going all the way back, and you see the repetition of forms, which makes it very invisible. And at that point, it's just filmmaking, right? It's just storytelling. You're just on a beautiful stage, a beautiful set, and your Bryce and her team just shot the scene. And a lot of those, and you can tell just sitting at Video Village, when it's like, okay, in-camera final, right? No VFX needed. And we celebrate all those moments because it means that all of that work that you put into kind of developing those things is kind of paying off. So to me, I think it's a nice bridge, between physical production and kind of the imaginary, right, virtual, but it also is a great way to keep the integrity of the initial kind of creative design, right? The initial spark of creativity for that scene starts at the very beginning with art, and you can trace it all the way through all the departments from pre-production to post-production. And so that initial idea is kind of maintained, right? The vision is maintained throughout, and I think that's very powerful.
How, in the same way that I've really enjoyed watching ILM's use of StageCraft develop and change, and find new ways to be used, but also to acknowledge that we don't have to use it. I feel like Grogu is another thing that benefits greatly from both a practical and digital approach. I mean, from day one on the series, right? Here, there's this extra dimension of him being in the IG-12 suit. And I'm really curious about the interplay, between legacy effects and when he needs to be CG, and now when he needs to go in that suit. How did that go down this series?
Yeah, it's been quite a journey with him, because on episode 1, season 1, as we were hurtling toward shooting, we knew we'd need a CG version, but none of us knew whether the CG or the puppet was going to be more sort of dominant in terms of the technique used. And you often don't know, right, when you're doing shows that have practical creatures that sometimes need to be CG. And so we did our best to have parity between the two, so the audience couldn't really tell we were using one or the other. But what everyone quickly discovered was that the puppet worked great. Not only were the puppeteers able to do with it what John wanted it to do, but just the camera loved it, the actors loved it. It just worked well. And then on top of that, John had a great philosophy for that, like particularly once he could see that it was really working, which was, you're down there on the set and you've blocked out some action for the puppet. And if it turns out that what was storyboard or previous is kind of impossible for the puppeteers to achieve, one mode of working is to just, say, all right, pull the puppet, shoot a clean plate, we'll do it in post. John's philosophy was, no. Let's stop for a second. Let's just take 5 minutes here and discuss this. Let's come up with something the puppet can do. And so that, coupled with the fact that it just worked great, and the puppeteers were getting better and better as the seasons have gone on, means that now we're very, very selective when we go CG. It's really just when we absolutely need to. If he's doing some forced jump and there was just no way to puppeteer that. And by the way, sometimes those are puppeteered. Some of them, like little forced jumps and flips that he does.
Right.
But those are the kind of things we do. Whereas on season 1, we were still experimenting with the character. So the first time he used the Force on the Mudhorn, that close-up was CG because we were figuring out his face and how expressive he should be and what it looks like when he uses the Force versus when Yoda does. And other moments like that. Now we know how the puppet works and that, frankly, less is more is the biggest weapon in the armada of the baby. The fact that he's so simple is his strength and power. Anyways, so flash forward to now, we had this extraordinary circumstance of him being seated inside IG-12 and IG-12 having to walk around. And Legacy really did a phenomenal job with both a kind of rod puppeted, what's it called? Is it Bunraku? Is that what it's called? Where there's an actor behind the full-size droid kind of walking it from behind. I think it was Mike Manziel killing his back. But that thing was remarkable and great. And then so then you could have a practical Grogu sitting in it as well for close-ups and things like that. But then, of course, we had shots where, IG-12 and Grogu were having to hustle along to keep up with all the Mandos running down the hallway, for instance. Shots like that where we needed to go all CG with both IG and Grogu. Or Mando's fighting off a couple of baddies and IG steps in to help, and that's a combination. Some of the close-ups are practical. Some of the wider shots where he's grappling with the bad guy's weapon and crushing it and doing things like that are CG. And So, but all that just to say that really the Legacy puppet and the puppeteers from Legacy are still really doing the heavy lifting when it comes to Grogu. And anytime we're doing him in CG, our goal is to mimic, not exceed what the puppet can do, so that the audience really doesn't know, like, that's CG because now his eyebrows moving or something. His eyebrows moving the puppet. But
the thing is, I have to say, there is just so much work in this series that I can't ask you both all about it. I mean, the dinosaur turtle in episode 1 is just incredible as well. But I do want to ask you both about one particular sequence, and that's the final episode and that jetpack battle, which I really feel like is so Star Wars and just really exciting. Grady, coming to you, what I'm interested in first is planning that. What you have to go through in terms of concepts and perhaps previs and just choreographing it. And then how I'll come to you about what animation challenges were. But Grady, tell me about talking about that sequence and planning it.
Yeah, that kind of all of the big action set pieces this season, that's the one that kept me up at night, quite frankly. It was it was definitely big on the page, and the concepts were had huge scope, right? You saw all of these Mandalorians kind of jetpacking inside of this massive cavern, right? This kind of subterranean base on Mandalore. Meanwhile, there's this big battle happening up in space, and then there's a battle down, a personal battle down on the ground. We honestly didn't know what that jetpack battle was for quite a while, and we had many conversations about how to do it or what the inspiration was. And it's one of the things that I've learned from John this season, which is when you're working on an idea or a scene, is to kind of know your genre, right? And commit to that genre, know your references. And so when we had all these kind of brainstorm sessions, and it was with John and of course Dave Filoni and Rick, and we started talking about that scene in terms of Braveheart and Gladiator, right? So we started thinking of other movies that have these really dynamic kind of fight sequences. In fact, we cut together this animatic. You were part of this, Hal, and of course, Paul. We actually cut in the scene from Braveheart where the two armies kind of collide and crush through each other. And then we cut in all of these little kinetic close-ups from Gladiator, all those really, really high-speed shots. And once we saw that cut, that little animatic, we knew we had a way better grasp of what this scene was. We'd kind of found our genre to kind of work inside of. And that's a big step, right? At least then we have a touchstone, a creative touchstone that all the creatives could kind of get behind. And then, of course, then it's Hal and Paul's world. It's a lot of previs and idea pitching, because again, we didn't know exactly what each beat was going to be whenever we cut to it during that fight. But another way we looked at the whole sequence is kind of similar to Return of the Jedi, because Jedi and others, but Jedi did this great job of having a battle take place at kind of multiple scales. You had, you have the kind of on the personal side, Luke, and he's there with the Emperor and Darth Vader, but then, the Emperor, gestures outside. Meanwhile, there's this massive space battle going on where his friends it looks like the Rebels are being decimated, right? So there's like a battle up there. There's a personal thing happening down here, and they could cut back and forth between the two. And it was just a great sequence, right? It was very dynamic. So we kind of did a similar thing with this. We said, okay, we have our battle, our space battle that all takes place kind of above this big, storm cover of Mandalore. And we were looking at, I'll let Hal talk about this, but like strafing runs from Jedi and others, right? Flying over the Star Destroyer. We were looking at the old miniature explosions as well from some of those old models shoots, the kind of the nature of all the live practicals that they used on those models. We actually wanted to emulate those as well. So we were kind of hitting those Jedi notes whenever when we were putting this thing together to kind of draw little analog connections to it. But then a lot of it's editorial, right? Because you establish a big fight here, then you have this very dynamic battle between our Mandalorian jetpackers and these new super commandos that also could jetpack, right? So you have like this maelstrom of fighting inside of this cavern, but then you have to know when, like, the real story that you're telling is the personal, right? You have to always go back down and reconnect with Mando and Bo, and probably on the smallest scale of them all is little Grogu, who eventually is, almost single-handedly kind of protects his family at the end of that battle. So there were so many parts to it, but that helped us kind of organize it in our heads once we started making connections to Return of the Jedi.
How did you help shape the story of that massive sequence?
Well, one of the toughest things about a sequence like this is that what you want it to feel like when you're cutting from the drama part of the story, Mando, Moff, Bo, the character moments, when you're cutting from that to the larger battle, cutting away to the larger battle, you want it to feel like you had 1,000 extras and stunt teams and everything. You spent a week shooting this amazing battle out on a field, let's just say, using the Braveheart analogy. And you've got all this material, and you can shape it in editorial, and you've got tons of stuff to, I love the way these two guys clash, and then that's got great energy. And then I'll cut to this other piece over here that isn't even related, but they just flow together nicely because of the energy of how these two come together and the way this body falls in the foreground and the horse runs through, the trouble is we're not doing that, right? We're crafting each CG battle shot bespoke for its moment filmed. And so the hard part is figuring out how to have that kind of energy as if you filmed the whole battle and you're just picking the best parts out of it, rather than feeling like this sort of canned idea that began as storyboards and then previs and then got animated, and then it wants to feel looser and more brutal and energetic than that. And that's always the hard part with something like this, because you're not crafting it in a way that you want it to feel like. So that's a huge challenge, and it can kind of delay. Like, what we were able to start working on very early was just ideas for fighting. Like Grady mentioned that sort of arithmetic of taking scenes from other movies. That was great for energy, and it helped John shape the narrative and the episode and the moments, figure out when are we cutting away and what are we cutting away from, because that's also essential to know. If you're cutting away from a line of dialogue, or you're cutting away from, if it was Return of the Jedi, the clash of two lightsabers, and then you're cutting to some ships flying through frame, or whether you're cutting to Han saying something funny about the detonator and the relevant, whatever. It really depends on what you're going to and what you're leaving behind and coming to. So it's chicken and egg thing. So the arithmetic helps. We can conceive a bunch of ideas in previs for fighting beats, just ideas about, this would be cool, this would be cool, this would be cool. Look, Casca fires her knee, drops down and fires her knee rockets and takes out this guy, etc. But until we know where the pieces are going to go and how they're going to be used, we can't really refine any of that. So there was a kind of a process there once we got in the middle where the live action had been shot and it was getting shaped into an episode, where we would try out stuff. We would present them with cuts and say, well, what do you think about using this chunk here and this chunk there? And then John and editorial, and then would think on it, and we'd all discuss it, and they'd think on it, and it would go back to editorial. A little bit later, we'd get a new cut, and we go, oh, that's interesting. Oh, they took that old piece of previs and put it there up against that piece. Oh, that's great, the way those two fit together. So it was a whole process like that. It wasn't all just about Annam iterating and iterating. It was editorial iterating, John thinking about it, maybe writing a little more, Annam doing its job, and gradually you sort of hammer it into shape. And it's tough, but it's rewarding. The other thing that was really tough in that sequence actually was before they get into the cave, the moment that the two groups of Mandos join together. That was the previs we had for that was sort of an adequate placeholder. By the way, Third Floor does all the previs on the Mando series, has done all the way from the beginning. They're fantastic, but they have to previs entire episodes, right? Because John likes to kind of prototype the episode to understand how it's working. But because of that, because they're not just prevising big visual effects sequences, but also just straight dialogue, everything else, soup to nuts through the whole episode, there isn't always time to refine every sequence to its ultimate form. In fact, there's never really time to do that. And so that sequence was really important to John dramatically, because it's the culmination of a lot of threads in terms of the stories of these different groups of Mandos. So that was tough. That was a tough nut to crack, to get it to where John really felt like this feels like the moment we've all been, that's been earned by all this storytelling. So just singling that out as a particularly challenging. And I would say Rick O'Connor at ILM, who is our anim soup at ILM, really gets a big pat on the back for the shot design, and a lot of the ideas there really came together, and he did some great work on it.
Well, I love that episode and all the eps. And as I say, there's so much to talk about. I mean, we haven't even got to the Mythosaur, and some of my favorite characters.
Minotaur, Turtle Gator.
Oh my goodness.
Flying creatures.
I gotta say, one of my favorites is the Babu Frick characters, just because extension from the film. Oh my gosh.
I was just going to ask, did you see the kind of behind the scenes stuff for the Anzellan workshop, we actually, for the first time, and at least on this show, the only time, they made like more of like a puppet or a Muppet stage, where it was a raised stage, and it was, so all the puppeteers are underneath, and then you had Mando kind of crammed in. It was amazing. It looked incredible, And so he's like, it's like this claustrophobic interior. But honestly, there wasn't much work for us to do. Like, every once in a while, you'd see the rods pop up, but that's kind of it. It was just a little rod removal. So because definitely with Grogu and a lot of stuff, but also just the Frick stuff, I think, from the movie, a lot of that was puppeteered from above and from the side. So puppeteering all this stuff from below, you get blocks and stuff. It was super fun to watch.
Well, I love the combination. But look, it's really nice to touch those elements, Grady, and how thank you for taking the time, and congratulations again on the series. Really, really cool.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Ian.